Welcome to the Standard Deviations podcast, presented by Orion Advisor Solutions and hosted by Dr. Daniel Crosby, Orion's Chief Behavioral Officer and New York Times best-selling author. Each week, Dr. Crosby interviews a fascinating new guest on a range of compelling topics, from literature to psychology to financial wellness. To learn more about Dr. Crosby's behavioral finance work at Orion, visit www.orion.com.
Hello and welcome to the Standard Deviations podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Daniel Crosby. Today, I'm joined by Dr. Moira Somers, author of Advice That Sticks: How to Give Financial Advice That People Will Follow. This is one of the biggest and least discussed problems in our industry. The book is absolutely fantastic, and I am so excited to have Dr. Moira on the show. Welcome.
Thank you so much.
So I don't know if you remember, the first and last time I saw you, you spoke in London at Humans Under Management, I believe it was, in like November or December of 2019. I was there with my daughter, who would have been about 10 years old at the time, and I took her to this professional conference, and two things happened. She absolutely fell in love with the British people. And the reason she fell in love with them is because she learned so many new words at that conference. She couldn't believe the amount of F-bombs that were dropped at a professional conference.
Oh no.
There was one very colorful speaker. It wasn't you, but there was one very colorful speaker who used a lot of language, and she just kept looking at me and giggling like she had just gotten away with the biggest coup. So that was the last time I saw you, and the world has fallen apart since then. So it's probably time for us to get back together and put things right again.
Yes, it is time.
So I want to begin by making the case for the work that you do, because as I said from the outset, it's this big problem, but I think it's an unspoken problem. And the thing that we'll be talking about today is non-compliance with advice, which is this insidious, powerful force in different parts of our life, from fitness to finance to medicine. Can you talk about, at sort of a macro level, this knowing-doing gap and the different ways that this impacts our lives in and out of finance?
Mm-hmm. Yes, it's a problem because as we go through our training, depending on the level of awareness of faculty who are doing the training, in many circumstances, all we're trained to do is to be technically excellent, to know the array of solutions for a given problem. And it's almost as though we've given ourselves dispensation. Once the advice has been delivered, it's not on us to help with follow through. But there's all kinds of problems with that way of thinking about it. The most concerning being is that it's simply not effective. And if you really do care about the people that you're serving, you do have to have some regard for your skill in advice delivery and your ability to be there so that follow through is increased. Increasingly within financial circles in particular, Daniel, there is now embedded in the regulatory standards for CFP professionals in Canada, in the US, in Britain, and around the world, there is now embedded sections about implementation responsibility as part of the ethical standards that have to guide us. The ethical guidelines. So increasingly it's being understood that you don't just do hit and run advice delivery, that you're there for the long run to determine whose responsibility is what aspect of this advice delivery and to ensure that it's actually taking place.
It's so important because, when I think about my training as a clinical psychologist, it really was just as you described it. I mean, it was really this technical acumen, like, here are the things you say, here's how you diagnose a problem, here's the intervention, with little to no focus to give on how it would be picked up by the client. And I think that that is such a powerful thing. And early in the book, you speak to a survey of medical doctors done in the 70s that found that only a quarter of them acknowledged that they themselves might have anything to do with patient noncompliance, and that their focus was, as you've mentioned, sort of the delivery of technical advice and then sort of washing their hands of it. And, what happens after that. Are we in financial services? Do we find ourselves in a similar place today where we're delivering advice with very little thought to how it gets picked up?
Absolutely. Absolutely. That's the state of the industry. And I use industry as opposed to profession because I think that is one of the hallmark differentiators. Within medicine, starting in the 80s, there was a wholesale shift, even in the language being used. So I've been on faculty at a medical school for a couple of decades, up until just last month, in fact. And within the medical school setting, we don't use the word non-compliance because it implies this level of doctor knows best. And if a patient has the temerity to disagree, well, then clearly they don't know what's best for them. And so that language itself has changed. And we don't speak about non-compliant patients. We speak about a problem of non-adherence with advice itself. And so the advice is the thing that doesn't adhere. And that isn't just semantics. It's actually like taking a step back and going, I wonder why that one didn't stick. I wonder what went wrong. Where was that slip twixt the cup and the lip so that this just didn't happen? And what the research showed from medicine was that actually, if you look at the outcome and variance, characteristics of the advice givers, characteristics of the physicians accounted for more of that variance than did characteristics of the clients. So for all kinds of reasons, because it's more professionally satisfying to give advice that sticks, because there are ethical implications for it, and because a lot more resides in us than it does in our clients, it behooves us to pay attention to this, to get better at advice delivery.
So perhaps we've been involved in some victim blaming and some shirking of our own responsibility. All of this sort of begs the question for me: what were the individual characteristics of advice givers that caused their advice to be stickier?
One of the biggest problems is jargon, incomprehensible language. That one is still huge within financial services, for sure. People talk about the experience of going into, annual review meetings and just having to sort of smile and nod and just like wait till it gets over because they don't know how to say, I don't have a clue. And it's even worse during discovery meetings. All those meetings you have with people who never come back. When you interview them, that's a big problem. They just did not understand what was being said, and nobody likes to be made to feel stupid.
Let me stop you with jargon for a minute. Do we use jargon because a fish doesn't know that it's wet, and we're so sort of swimming in this water of jargon that it doesn't seem as esoteric to us as it may appear to the clients, or is it sort of a perceived lack on our part, or a desire to look professional, or a desire to sort of puff ourselves up? And, I think as a young therapist, I used a lot more jargon than I would today because I was I was insecure and I was trying to give some semblance of professional feeling, right? And so is it just that we're so immersed in it? Are we trying too hard to look impressive? Is it something else? What do you think?
I think it's not either or. I think there's a whole lot of things. There is the problem of the curse of knowledge, which you alluded to, where once you're trained in a thing, it's hard for you to remember what it was like to not know that thing. And you've been inculcated into the culture. Physicians learn 13,000 to 15,000 new terms in the course of their training. I don't think financial professionals are that far behind. And it is the water in which we swim. And we really have to make sure that we are speaking in a way that people can get. Another problem in terms of advisor characteristics has to do with perceived warmth. Another problem has to do with, do you have processes in place for what to do when you hit impasses? Do you have processes in place for that would actually make it easier for people to follow through with stuff? Or are you delivering advice as though there's nothing else going on in the client's life, as though they don't have competing demands on time, energy, and money? Are you being culturally sensitive, as well as targeted to what this particular client needs assistance with, in terms of making better trade-offs, in terms of getting clarity on how their financial behavior is or isn't aligned with what they want out of life? So, I used to be a little bit indignant about the possibility that maybe I wasn't being effective. And it's like, wait a minute, I don't have control over what they do. But you realize, you don't have control, but you've got huge amounts of influence. And you can enlist them as implementation partners regularly through the course of the meeting by saying, what about what I just said wasn't clear? Or what do you think about this recommendation? Is that really top of mind for you? If we tackle this, is this the most important thing? What would be even more important? If you did do this thing, how confident are you could get it done? What would get in the way? Who could help you? Like all of those things that are now just bred in the bone for me about how to make sure that I'm being relevant and helpful to the people that I'm trying to work with, trying to be of service to.
So, I want to spend a little bit more time with a few of these things you've mentioned, because I think they're powerful. I know in my training as a therapist, we spend an enormous amount of time on cultural sensitivity and sort of the ins and outs of counseling folks from different cultures. I don't, admittedly, I'm not in the deep end of this world, but I don't get the sense that financial advisors get the same level of training. For financial advisors who are seeking greater cultural sensitivity, where do they look? Because I can speak, from spending time for most of my career in a predominantly white, predominantly middle-class part of the world, and then moving to Hawaii for a period of time where I was counseling with people from literally all over the world. I can tell you that my bag of tricks that worked in my former life did not always work, and was sometimes 180 degrees of what was, what was indicated when I was working with these diverse populations. So for advisors who have an interest in seeking this out, is there a good place you'd recommend they start?
Oh, it's such a problem. As within, I know the CFP board is doing its best to try and address underrepresentation among CFP professionals themselves. I spoke at a conference yesterday, and somebody talked about his belief that there were just some cultures that weren't good with money. And as we talked about it over time, he began to see that maybe it's that he doesn't know how to skillfully address people from that culture. Mm-hmm. Everybody on this planet is descended from a long line of survivors. Everybody has skills for coping in the environment in which they live. And so just that awareness, first of all, that if anytime you're hit by judgment or disdain or frustration, that the first place you need to look is at you. Mm. And to say, am I lacking skill in this area? Different cultures have different styles of dealing with money. North America is predominantly a consumer culture. Many parts of Asia are predominantly savings cultures. And then there are subcultures within each one. And then there's how your own family, like the microculture. And so developing skills for being culturally fluent, which begins with, teach me what I need to know about you. Or to specifically seek out courses and to specifically bring people into your practice that will just be more skilled than you are at dealing with these things. The willingness to consider that there are valid perspectives about money aside from yours will stand you in good stead, not only with people who look different from you or who believe different from you, but even people who are just going through a different life transition for you, or who, God forbid, dare to disagree with you about what they should do with a certain asset they might have, for example. And so it's part of being an adherence partner or an implementation partner that you become increasingly willing to hold the reins lightly, not on what your technical training is, but on its suitability for the particular people in front of you. And that you work to co-create a plan that combines the best of the technical advice with what is possible for this individual in this social situation at this point in time.
Yeah, I love a couple of things about what you said. Teach me what I need to know about you. Just being inquisitive, just being generous and asking questions. I think that works for jargon. What's your level of understanding? Teach me and let me tailor my instruction to your level. Teach me and let me tailor my advice to your cultural, your pillars of your cultural belief system. I think these are a simple but a powerful thing. I also love the piece about this isn't the only thing going on in their lives. Right? We eat, sleep, and breathe money, and think that other people watch the markets as closely as we do, and get as excited about an ETF as we do, and it's simply not the case. So you started to give some advice there around, almost like a premortem, like what if something were to go wrong here, what would go wrong? How can we acknowledge and respect that these folks have other things going on, and that this may not be their highest priority?
Sure. Just before we go there, I want to circle back to the teach me what I need to know about you comment. I think that sometimes people get weary of being asked to be sort of the cultural guide to their particular culture. And I don't mean for us to turn around and put the burden on people to explain their culture as a whole, but I really wanted to focus on the teach me what I need to know about you. You. Because even though you might be part of a North American consumer culture, you may still be very committed to saving, right? So it's really the N of one in front of us that we have to understand and to develop skills in working for. But yes, to go back then to that other question about the premortem, which is, a funny way of saying, can you anticipate in advance how things might go wrong and then work to head that off at the pass? It's not just a good intellectual exercise. It's a way of signaling to your client that you care about their bandwidth and that you do not want to be putting anything on their plate that is going to just frankly overburden them. Even think about the experience of having a couple in your office that you're giving financial advice to. And darn well, you are picking up the vibe that one of them is not fully in alignment. And if you just send them off because we want to speak to the person who's nodding and really enthusiastic, and we're just going to ignore the one who's gone silent, we know that if you send them off in that state, you're setting them up for a fight. One of them is going to be much less happy about coming back to you. And so to be willing to bring reality into your office and to stop pretending that advice happens in a vacuum. It doesn't. It happens in the context of hugely competing demands for time and energy as well as for money.
I think it's one of the biggest differences between therapy and sort of conversation out in the real world is the willingness for a therapist, and in this case, a financial advisor, to sort of call out what's happening in the here and now, right? To sort of call out like, wow, it looks like there's some discomfort here. Can we talk about that? That's not something you commonly do with people at the grocery store or with even people at work. So it's a skill that I think we're a little bit uncomfortable with. But once you start doing it, it's so powerful and it's so energizing. And I think it's so relieving for people who are communicating things to you with their body language or through other means, which aren't being addressed. And you're right, papering over them, ignoring them in pursuit of sort of just getting through a meeting sets them up for a bad outcome and makes them less likely to follow through on our advice or even to come back.
Well, what are some of the selection criteria, at least the historic self-selection criteria for getting into financial services? For many people, it was that they were excellent talkers. They were really good salespeople. And I'm sure everybody listening to this podcast has probably worked with people to help them get out from underneath the problems that those people caused by talking them into investments that were entirely unsuitable and unsustainable. So back to how much influence the advisor has over things. Your willingness to give up airtime in a session is critical. It actually is associated with greater client satisfaction. The more airtime the client has, the greater their satisfaction with the meeting, especially in those critical first few meetings, but also when they're going through big life transitions where they're in totally unfamiliar territory and they just need to make sure that you understand that they're in a different space than they may have been even last month because their spouse just died, or they just got an offer for their business, or they just received an inheritance, and money's in motion, but so is their identity.
So one of the pieces of your book that I've really taken with me is the portion that talks about the sort of advice that's easy to take versus the sort of advice that's more difficult to take. And if we understand this sort of mental model, it allows us to get our antenna up for times when we might need to be extra warm or, extra good listeners or extra supportive. Do you mind running us through at a high level? What are some of the characteristics of hard to implement versus easier to implement advice?
So easy to implement advice is fun to do. It's pleasurable. I'm thinking about a girlfriend who was told she had to drink this really dark beer after she had given birth because she was iron deficient. She loved that recommendation. That was just a delightful piece of advice for her. So it's pleasant. It's linked to relief of a here and now problem. So think about when you're given an antibiotic because you've got an abscessed tooth, like you are so motivated to take that pill. And then how you forget to take it 3 days down the road because the pain's gone. Maybe you don't really need it now.
Yeah.
So it's pleasurable. It's linked to relief of a here and now problem. It's just a short-term behavior. Right? So I just have to swallow that pill and then I'm kind of done with my part of it. So as opposed to I've got to lose 50 pounds because I was just diagnosed with diabetes and I'm in danger of losing my eyesight. Mm-hmm. You've got a here and now problem, all right, but what you're being told to engage in does not result in immediate relief. In fact, it may be uncomfortable. Mm-hmm. Advice that's easy to follow is kind of within your own level of, within your own sphere of familiarity. It's not culturally weird or personally weird. An advice that's easy to follow is supported or monitored. So the flip side then goes for advice that's hard to follow. Advice that's hard to follow is unmonitored. So in the financial advising world, how often do we tell people, look, you really need to get your will done, and you need to do the whole, set up guardians for your children. It's like, oh, great. I didn't have a problem, right? And this is not pleasant to contemplate my death and to have, discussions with my spouse about who we'd want to raise our children. And it's expensive. It's incurring a cost and it's unmonitored. You just told me to go do it, and I'm left on my own to do it. And that's why it's one of those items that is, how many years do people kick that can down the road, right? Well, I guess we don't have to worry about who's going to raise our kids anymore because they're 34 now, but we still don't have a will. So that's, no matter what domain of life you're giving advice in, those hard to follow versus difficult to follow categories exist.
It occurs to me that most financial advice is going to be in that hard to follow category. I mean, saving money is perceived as a present loss, right? So we know that's difficult for people. Investing money takes long-termism. It takes comfort with uncertainty and risk that doesn't come very naturally to us. Mm-hmm. As you've pointed out, things like thinking about insurance and estate planning cause us to contemplate our own impermanence, which we hate. I mean, like so many of the things that a financial advisor is asking her clients to do are really psychologically difficult.
Absolutely. It's just, and that's not our fault, but it is our problem, right?
Right.
We have to take that on and say, are there any ways that we can change not the nature of the advice, but how we roll it out, or how much support we offer, how much supervision, how much delight, how much community can we provide? So many different ways of making it better and easier for people to do hard things.
Yeah, another portion of your book that I really liked, you have sort of this acronym, this framework for giving advice that sticks. I'm not going to give it away. I want people to go buy your book, but we're going to talk about one piece of it here, and it's understanding client differences. We've talked a bit about understanding advisor differences that lead to success. How do you think about those individual differences? Because as a therapist, as a psychologist, I use the big five, right? When I'm thinking about people, I use the big five personality as sort of a mental scaffolding around which to think about personality differences. When we're attending to these individual differences, because this is a hot topic in wealth management, all about personalization, is there a framework we can use to think about those personal differences, or is it really as simple as your previous admonition to just say, hey, teach me about you and sort of the microeconomy of you and your family?
Is it psychologists? We get our doctorates in psychometrics. We love pulling apart tests and looking at reliability and validity and constructing really good tests. And, you've got your favorite, I've got my favorite, I've written some of them. But the older I get, I just care less and less about trait, Daniel, and more about state. Because let's say somebody's high in agreeableness. Okay, we know that there are certain financial risks or benefits associated with each of these big five. Even the most agreeable person can come into your office on an ornery day. And do you know how to work with somebody who's in this particular state of unease or excitability or depletion? So even though I just love and respect the work that a lot of people are doing in this domain, and I want to participate in making it better, I am worried that advisors can over-index on that stuff. They can sort of feel like they know their client because they've done this, even something like a risk profile, a risk tolerance profile. So no, I don't think you've done your work, because the first market correction, they're not going to really care if you pull out the test and say, but you said
you were supposed to be chill.
You were supposed to be chill, right? So I think what we all need to do is develop skills for appreciating the fact that every one of us is prone to cognitive bias. And when we correct for one, we invite its opposite to then show up. And what we most need to do is help people take time to make good decisions that are unencumbered by temporary unhelpful emotions, but informed by those deeper level emotions that we might refer to as purpose and value.
So even someone who has what may normally be a fairly enduring trait may find themselves at a time of emotional upheaval in a state that contradicts that. So it's not a one and done assessment of that client. It's a willingness to go back and back and back and understand them in the moment, see where they're at, and address their needs in that moment.
Yeah. There's a reason why the majority of financial advisors' new clients come to them during times of major life transition. And I think it's twofold. Sort of on the positive side, people understand that, there's money in motion as a result of this major life, getting married, getting divorced, for example. Money is in motion. Things need to get decided. But I think, some of those new clients are coming because they just fired their old advisor. They fired their old advisor because the advisor didn't know how to work with them when they were in this state of depletion, which is associated with heightened emotional responsivity. I'm a neuropsychologist by training. I can point to the area of the brain that gets put offline and some areas of the brain that come more into play when people are worn out. So all of your testing is good. It can help remind people who they are. It can help remind you of who they are when they're at their best or at their usual. I'm not always sure that the test developers have done a really good job of helping advisors say, okay, this is what you do with these data.
So, as we have gotten deeper into this conversation, all of it seems like, I'd say, a highly bespoke and deeply empathic way to approach clients. And yet you also speak in your book to the dangers of excessive empathy. I think empathy is having a moment. I think Brene Brown and others have brought empathy, very much into the spotlight. Talk to us about the dangers of excessive empathy in a client-advisor relationship.
Yes. Part of it is just a definitional issue. And if you spend any time in the literature on empathy, you'll realize there are approximately 4,000 different definitions of it. So I'm going to just speak very generically about what happens to us when our level of caring about the trials that an individual might be undergoing, the struggles that they might be experiencing, what happens when that causes us to enter so deeply into their experience that we lose our objectivity. So, as a fellow therapist, you probably know what it's like to work with somebody who's so depressed that your world slowly turns gray over the course of 50 minutes, and you're thinking, "Oh my gosh, they're right. It's horrible. It's hopeless," And you have to have this ability to separate your experience from theirs. If somebody's royally upset by their ex-spouse, it doesn't help for you to join in the indignation. And so the empathy involves noticing what somebody else is feeling, like really being attuned to it. That's the first part of empathy. It's an emotion, it's a noticing, an emotional awareness. And the second part is sort of a cognitive aspect of being able to understand it and being willing to understand it from their perspective, and then moving into the behavioral. What does this mean is required of me? At times, advisors can go, they can err, all of us can err on either side of it, where we are undone by the extent of people's emotional pain, and we can't be as helpful as we want to, or we can go the other way. And this is often what happens when we become personally depleted ourselves, is that we throw empathy overboard like it's unnecessary ballast. It's like, well, I cannot deal with this one today. So today we're only going to deal with the facts, ma'am. And we don't connect warmly enough because we feel like we don't have it in us to give. So the one author talks about making sure that you stay within this zone of rational compassion. And I really liked that idea as a bit of a North Star about not getting pulled down into their experience and losing what it is that you have to offer people other than, tea and sympathy, and not hardening your heart off in that process. Rational compassion. That's it. For me, that's been really helpful.
I love this idea of rational compassion because I've seen firsthand, both from a burnout perspective and an over-identification, sort of losing your objectivity perspective, what that looks like. And it's like we need sufficient empathy. That's the compassion, right? But we also need sufficient distance to maintain our objectivity and our rationality. And there is such a thing as empathy fatigue, where we throw it overboard like so much ballast. I'm going to whiff on the numbers, but Brad Klontz and some of his colleagues did research on anxiety and depression among advisors following the great financial crisis, and it was staggering. I mean, the numbers were absolutely staggering as these advisors had sat in the offices or had sat with clients day after day, hearing their sad stories and sort of absorbing their worry as a buffer between them and a bad decision. Mm-hmm. It really takes a toll on us. So we need that compassion, but we need a measure of objectivity and rationality if we're really going to be able to help people over the long term. I think it's a great North Star. So I think anyone that has listened to this podcast now has a deep sense that you are a unique voice in the industry and that you approach things in a unique and a powerful way. If people are as in love with your ideas as I am, where can they read more about your work? Where can they find your book and just learn more about all the great things we've talked about today?
That's kind of you. Thank you. If they're interested in these ideas, the book is called Advice That Sticks. And I have a website, moneymindandmeaning.com, which, is my attempt to pull together some of the profound ways in which financial advisors touch the lives of their clients and the ways in which we all can get better at doing that.
Right. Wonderful. Please go out and buy the book. Support Dr. Moira and her incredible work. Thank you again. From a wannabe Canadian to a wonderful Canadian, thank you for joining us today and sharing all your wisdom with us.
Oh, thanks for the invite. It's been delightful.
Thanks for tuning in to Standard Deviations. If you can't wait till next week for more behavioral finance insights, visit www.orion.com. All opinions expressed by Dr. Daniel Crosby and podcast guests are solely their own opinions and do not reflect the opinion of or endorsement by Orion and its affiliates, subsidiaries, and employees. This podcast is for informational purposes only and should not be relied upon as a basis for legal, tax, and investment decisions. The opinions are based upon information the participants consider reliable.